Just imagine, for a second, a world so terrified of madness, so utterly desperate for a cure, that it would welcome a monster. Picture asylums overflowing with tormented souls, families just frantic for any shred of hope, any kind of release. They prayed for a miracle, and the answer they got came from the tip of an ice pick. So today, we're diving into one of the darkest chapters in medical history. And I want to be clear, this was not a precise surgical procedure. This was a brutal act of psychic demolition, a monstrous answer to a desperate prayer. And believe it or not, it all started with chimpanzees. So, picture this. It's 1935. A Portuguese neurologist, Egas Moniz, is at a medical conference. And he watches this presentation about two chimps who, after having parts of their frontal lobes taken out, became completely docile. I mean, where there was rage, there was now just this placid emptiness. And a truly horrifying thought sparked in Moniz's mind. Could he do the same thing to people? His first attempts were, frankly, a primitive violation. He'd have a surgeon drill these crude holes straight into a patient's skull. Top, sides, didn't really matter. And then he would inject pure alcohol, literally burning away living brain tissue, destroying whatever he imagined was the source of their torment. But this kind of butchery was way too slow, too surgical, for the man who would become the procedure's high priest, an American doctor named Walter Freeman. Now here's the crucial part. He wasn't a surgeon. He had no business wielding a scalpel, but he had this terrifying vision to bring this procedure to the masses. See, Freeman was a showman, a crusader for his own grotesque cause. He wasn't happy staying in an operating room. He wanted an assembly line. He literally toured the country, sometimes out of a camper van he called the lobotomobile, on what he called his head-hunting expeditions, bringing his own special brand of brain surgery to the desperate, overflowing state hospitals of America. And what he came up with was a whole new level of medical horror. A procedure so simple, so brutal, he could do it in his office in minutes. He realized he didn't need to drill through the thickest part of the skull. No, he found a shortcut, a back door into the human mind. And the first tool he used to invade the brain wasn't some specialized, sterilized surgical instrument. No, it was an ice pick, pulled directly from his own kitchen drawer. A common household tool now repurposed for mutilating minds. The procedure itself was just a nightmare of clinical violence. First, the patient would be knocked out with a jolt of electroshock. Then Freeman would pull back their eyelid, slide the ice pick into the corner of the eye socket, and take up a mallet. You'd hear that tap, tap, tap of the hammer striking the pick, and then the sickening crack as it punched through the paper-thin bone behind the eye. Then he'd just wiggle the pick back and forth, scrambling the frontal lobes into pulp before pulling it out and doing the exact same thing to the other eye. 2 inches. Just let that sink in. A sharpened steel spike hammered through your eye socket, 2 inches deep into the very part of your brain that makes you, you. The seat of your personality, your awareness, your soul, just shredded in a matter of seconds. And the whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Freeman was a performer. He would sometimes use a carpenter's hammer just for dramatic effect. He even got to the point where he'd put picks in both eyes at once to show off his horrific efficiency. 10 minutes to inflict a lifetime of damage, to hollow out a human being. Now this horror wasn't just inflicted randomly. Oh no. It was a targeted campaign against society's most vulnerable, the people who were locked away, the people who were different, the people who had no voice to scream no. The scale of this atrocity is just staggering. Some estimates say 50,000 people in the United States alone had their brains surgically violated, 50,000 minds extinguished. This wasn't some rare last-ditch procedure. It was a plague of surgical violence. And it was a deeply gendered plague. Nearly 60% of the victims were women. And you have to ask why. It's because the lobotomy became a tool of social control, a way to silence wives who were too difficult, daughters who were too rebellious, or just any woman who refused to conform. It was the ultimate violent enforcement of social norms. The cruelty was also steeped in a monstrous racism. One surgeon, Dr. Robert Bailey, actually defended experimenting on Black patients by saying it was, and I quote, cheaper to use them than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals. Freeman himself believed Black women were the best candidates, using them as test subjects before he felt he'd perfected the procedure enough to use it on white people. And the state itself became an agent of this mutilation. The U.S. government authorized the lobotomy of nearly 2,000 veterans, men who were shattered by war, only to be broken even further by their own country. And Freeman's depravity? Well, it knew no bounds. He performed his ice pick procedure on 19 children. The youngest was just 4 years old. The net of potential victims was cast terrifyingly wide. Just about any deviation from the norm could land you under Freeman's ice pick. Homosexuality, trauma from war, chronic depression, even just bad headaches. Anything and everything could be twisted into a justification for scrambling your brain. So what was the point of all this butchery? Well, Freeman himself gave the chilling answer. He wasn't promising a cure. He was promising, in his own words, a surgically induced childhood. The goal was not to heal, but to regress, to turn a troubled adult into a vacant, docile child. And the results were a catalog of human wreckage. Patients were left as apathetic, empty shells. Many suffered from paralysis, seizures, loss of bladder control, amnesia. They became incoherent, unable to form thoughts, unable to feel. They suffered a complete and total loss of personality. For so many, it was a fate far, far worse than death. And the medical literature at the time didn't mince words. Before the procedure, a patient might be described as anxious or agitated. But after, well, doctors and observers used other terms. They called the victims vegetables. They called them lost souls. It was like their inner selves had been surgically scooped out. The story of Rosemary Kennedy, sister of a future president, is probably the most famous and horrifying example. During her procedure, which was performed while she was awake, Freeman asked her to recite prayers and sing songs. The surgeon just kept cutting until her words became garbled and incoherent, and that was the signal that enough brain had been destroyed. They left her with the mind of an infant in a woman's body for the rest of her life. And now we come to the final, and maybe the most sickening chapter of this whole story. Because this campaign of horror, this reign of the ice pick, it wasn't condemned in its time. No, it was celebrated. In 1949, for his pioneering work in destroying human minds, Egas Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the world's highest medical honor given for an atrocity. The Nobel Prize for a procedure that created thousands of vegetables and lost souls. The contrast is just obscene. You have a world applauding, while the victims, their minds completely erased, sat silent in institutions, totally forgotten. The ice pick lobotomy has, thankfully, been thrown into the dustbin of medical history. But the desperation that birthed it, that still exists. That desire to quiet the unruly, to simplify the complex, to silence the difficult. And it leaves us with a really haunting question. We may have put away the ice pick, but how many new, more subtle ways have we found to